These things can go round and round and round, and we can blow as much.
Do clean air zones actually clean the air? Today, can the Conservative Party chairman stay in office amid questions about his tax affairs? Do clean air zones actually clean the air? And should nurses be using food banks? This is Politics Live. With me today, Conservative MP Gareth Bacon, Labour MP Chris Bryant, Conservative commentator Albion Ancona and editor of the House magazine Rosa Prince. Today, the Prime Minister orders an ethics inquiry into the Conservative Party chairman. Nadhim Zahawi paid a penalty to the taxman when he was Chancellor. The Prime Minister says there are still questions that need answering.
When situations like this arise, we deal with them promptly, we deal with them professionally, and that's what we're doing in this case.
Everybody knows it's wrong. He clearly isn't going to resign, and so the Prime Minister needs to show some leadership.
Questions too about the role of the BBC chairman and his links to Boris Johnson. Also today,
we cannot delay. Londoners' lives depend on urgent action to clean up our air.
will expanding London's clean air zones actually improve the air quality? Nurses on strike last week over pay, but do nurses need to use food banks?
If you're earning £35,000, then you oughtn't to routinely need to use a food bank.
Let's start with this story, headline in the Daily Telegraph. National Grid ready to pay customers to switch off. This is the story that up to 1 million households in England, Scotland and Wales will be paid to use less electricity between 5 and 6 o'clock this evening as part of a scheme to avoid future potential blackouts. We spoke actually about smart meter anxiety last week as people were finding it very difficult to keep watching the amount of money they spend on energy go up minute by minute. But on this particular scheme, starting with you, Gareth, would you take cash to switch off the lights?
Well, I think in my own case, it's unlikely to be applicable because I gather it's between 5 and 6 p.m. and sadly for me, I'm going to be in Westminster the whole of that time, so it probably wouldn't apply.
But if it did?
But I think the scheme is aimed at saving energy and reducing people's bills at the same time. I'm in the fortunate position where I probably wouldn't need to take advantage of that, but I gather there will be some people who could. And they can't be penalised if they decide to take part of the scheme and then change their mind. So I don't see any downside to it.
Would you do it, Chris? Would you take some money to switch off the lights at a peak time?
I wouldn't. But that's because I'm in a very fortunate situation as an MP. We're well paid and, you know, there are undoubtedly, I have got lots of families in the Rhondda who are very worried about their energy bills, and I'm sure they would. 5 to 6 is, of course, the most difficult time for most families. If you've got kids, they're coming in, you're cooking their supper and all of that kind of stuff. And I think it is going to be very difficult for people, and I don't quite understand how the scheme works. But it is also true that we've got to learn to use less energy if we possibly can. One of the things I feel very angry about is over the last 12 years, we've hardly done anything about insulating people's homes. Yeah,
I mean, do you think it's a good idea for both those reasons we've heard from the MPs that gets people used to the idea of perhaps conserving energy, but also that people will be helped out with their high energy bills?
I certainly think it's an interesting idea. I think the broader question is whether or not we're going to have to become more used to this kind of action in the future as the energy mix in the United Kingdom changes. I think there's some implications that this actually might be as a result of the fact that it's not been very windy recently, so they're having to rely on coal. So is this a question of the UK's energy mix, and is that going to be more of an issue as we transfer over to renewables?
Would you do it if you had a smart meter? Would you have applied for a discount to switch off the lights and get a bit of cash back?
I think if I was in a position where I needed the cash back, I would, but, you know, I'm well paid enough not to need to do that. But I think for families who do need help with their bills, it's going to be something which is going to be very helpful and also reduce the amount of energy which is used.
Rosa?
Well, I was thinking about, as Chris said, the timing. So I could maybe just about persuade the kids that they didn't need the tea, perhaps even persuade them they shouldn't turn on the TV and we can all play Snakes and Ladders. But if I can't have a cup of tea today between 5 and 6 o'clock on a cold day like today, I think no one would be benefiting. So, no, I think I couldn't do it.
I mean, what about the idea that people be paid to do this? Shouldn't people just do it anyway?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't feel like something that's going to solve our energy crisis, does it? It feels like a bit of spin, a bit of almost a cosmetic exercise to get people thinking about whether they need to have their electricity on. So I think if it's done that, if it's got on a couple of front pages, then the scheme has probably done its job. I would be interested to see the figures coming out of it and whether enough energy has been saved to make a difference. My theory would be that it wouldn't, but I guess we'll find out.
No, you'll have your cup of tea later on, as I'm having mine now. Do you think there should be more altruism around this issue, people taking that sort of responsibility themselves?
Well, altruism is always good, but I think one of the things that we've failed on in the last few years is having a clear direction of travel on renewable energy. You know, the on-off issue around whether we're going to have more wind farms on land, which we've had over the last 18 months, hasn't helped. There's a good point about whether the wind blows in the right direction, whether it blows properly. I can see from my house in the Rhondda that sometimes the wind farms aren't producing anything. So we need a complete mix. But I don't feel as if we've really seized this with the determination and, frankly, the energy that we need.
Do you agree?
Up to a point, yes. I mean, I think it is true to say that renewable energies it's not as far forward as it could have been, perhaps. But the war in the Ukraine has certainly focused minds on that. And I think that the scheme that's been announced by National Grid over the last couple of days is focusing minds. And I think it's too early to say whether it will work, but we will see what happens.
All right, let's talk about Nadhim Zahawi, the Conservative Party chairman, who has been asked lots of questions about his tax affairs. He's determined to stay on. We now know that Nadhim Zahawi paid outstanding tax owed, plus a penalty. You can see here the BBC News story. Nadhim Zahawi, tax row, Conservative Party chairman, determined to stay on. We also understand that the sort of ballpark figure of the entire settlement, we don't know for sure, is around £5 million, not insubstantial. And it happened at the time that he was briefly Chancellor last summer. Gareth, what's your view about this? Do you think Nadhim Zahawi can actually stay in post?
Well, I think, so if we get to the facts of the issue, I understand this is to do with founder shares that were granted to his father when Nadhim set up YouGov about 20 or so years ago. And of course, that company has grown exponentially, and Nadhim has a whole load of business interests. And I understand that questions were being asked when he was about to be appointed as Chancellor of the Exchequer. And in common with many businesses, there was a dispute between his business and the HMRC about the level of tax owed. And he, rather than prolong it, paid what they demanded. And this is something that happens a lot with high net worth individuals and happens with companies, that there is a dispute around these things and you come to negotiate a settlement.
Right.
In his case...
But he was someone who was going to be Chancellor, who was in charge, effectively, of HMRC.
Yes, but the point that needs to be made here is that Nadhim Zahawi is not an accountant. His company employs accountants and they were advising him on his tax affairs. And so it wasn't... And HMRC's own language said that this was a careless omission. That's their language, not his. Rather than an attempt to evade tax, which would, of course, would be illegal. Yes. And so
careless to the tune of, if the whole settlement was around £5 million. But so you think he should stay in post?
Well, that's not for me to say. I mean, that's very much
you must have a view, Gareth. Do you think he should stay, or do you think now there's this ethics inquiry that's been launched, do you think he should be at least suspended, or at least... No.
No,
okay.
And the reason is because we live in a society where you are innocent until proven guilty, not the other way around.
Chris?
Well, I've got to be very careful because, as I understand it, I read in one of the newspapers today that there's been a complaint to the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, as well as the investigation that I think you're talking about, which I presume means that Rishi Sunak has told the independent advisor on the Ministerial Code that he should investigate.
That's exactly right.
Now, if the Parliamentary Commissioner launches an investigation, that could theoretically come to my committee, which I chair, and so I can't hold a view.
OK, well, that's...
I mean, I've got a view broadly on... transparency, and I think transparency is really important.
Well, I think most people would agree with that, wouldn't they?
Well, yes, but and probably the best way for that to be resolved is, of course, for Nadhim Zahawi to come on the programme and explain everything. But one of the things that really worries me, if you try to find out the full list of ministerial interests at the moment, the last time they were published was last May. The list of ministerial interests at the moment, available online, isn't even an accurate list of ministers.
All right.
It's a list of the government 3 ago.
All right. Well, do you think there's been enough transparency? Some of your colleagues have said not. We've heard at least 2 Conservative MPs saying he needs to get everything out there, and he should have done so.
Well, I mean, I think within hindsight, he probably would agree with that because it would have made the whole thing go away. But ministers are required to declare their ministerial interest, and the point Chris makes there, I think, is a reasonable one. The ministerial interest should be as up to date as members of Parliament's interest, and I would be inclined to agree with that.
I just want to... We're going to go to my colleague, our correspondent, in just a moment. But can Nadhim Zahawi still fulfil his role as party chairman while all of these questions are still swirling?
Yes, I think he can. I think Gareth is absolutely right to say that we do live in a society where people are innocent until proven guilty. And, and I'm glad that the Prime Minister has called in an investigation with the independent ethics advisor. And I think we'll have to reserve our judgment until that conclusion has been made. I know Nadhim has contributed a lot to CCHQ with data.
That's the Conservative Central Office.
And I think one of the big problems, though, for Rishi Sunak is undoubtedly Nadhim's main asset is that he's a great media performer. And he can't do that at the moment because all that's going to happen is good journalists like you will ask about his tax affairs.
Thank you. And Nadhim Zahawi, you can come on the programme at Chris's invitation any time to explain your tax affairs. Let's talk to our chief political correspondent. I'll come back to you in just a moment, Rosa, Nick Eardley. Listening to the discussion here, can he stay on, Nick?
Well, look, I think he wants to, Jo, and I think that by ordering this investigation, the Prime Minister has probably bought Nadhim Zahawi a bit time because, this morning there was just this deluge of further questions for the Tory chairman about how much he'd paid in a penalty to HMRC, about how what has emerged now matched up with some of his previous comments. And I think there was a real question this morning about his future. If you have that investigation, though, it gives ministers that cover of saying, well, we need to see what happens with the investigation. Let's leave it to the independent advisor to go and look at that. So my hunch is that he probably does have a bit time just now. But there's also the possibility, I suppose, the more comes out. And if that keeps happening, it's more and more of an embarrassment for the Prime Minister. And it makes it harder and harder for him to justify keeping him in the job if he's going to keep talking about integrity and accountability.
Well, Nick, I'm going to show our guests and viewers a clip of Nadhim Zahawi in an interview on Sky News last summer when he was Chancellor. Let's have a listen.
I was being told that the Serious Fraud Office, that the National Crime Agency, that HMRC are looking into me. I'm not aware of this. I've always declared my taxes. I paid my taxes in the UK. I will answer any questions HMRC has of me.
Nick, is there any conflict between what he said there in that interview and what's happening now?
Well, look, I think that's probably in the eye of the beholder, to be honest with you, Jo. Some people might find it quite hard to square the idea that he's suggesting there that HMRC aren't looking at him at all. And what we know now is that when he was Chancellor, he did settle a dispute which included paying a penalty. We've not had an explanation of that from Team Zahawi this morning, but I get the impression that what he intends to do is basically ride this out. To say to the public, look, I've paid this because it was the right thing to do. I didn't challenge it because it would have complicated things, and ultimately I ended up paying the tax that I was due. But you're going to keep hearing accusations and criticism that it was too late, and that actually this just leaves a whole question mark over Mr Zahawi and over the government.
We're going to come back to you in just a moment. Rosa, what about the political capital being expended by Rishi Sunak over this?
Yeah, I think that's actually a very important point. I mean, there are two things. One is that Rishi Sunak came to office saying, I'm going to be a man of integrity. This is a complete change from what went before with Boris Johnson's government. The other thing is this perception that he's a bit out of touch. He's a multimillionaire himself. He has people around him who are very wealthy. At a time of a cost of living crisis, can he afford to have someone there in this important role who says, oh, I forgot to pay my $5 million. I've done it now, no problem. I think actually the answer to that question is people like Gareth, and whether Conservative MPs are going to be coming to the Prime Minister and saying, we can't campaign with this guy in situ. We're having our constituents coming up to us and saying, you guys don't understand what we're going through. And I think if people like Gareth and other backbenchers begin to do that, then I think Nadhim Zahawi is in more trouble than actually the findings of these various investigations.
Gareth?
Well, I mean, I'm not a high net worth individual, so these things are not something that I have to worry about personally on a daily basis.
No, but can you imagine constituents saying you are out of touch, your party is out of touch?
Well, I can understand that they might say that given the media coverage that we've had, but this is precisely why it's been referred to the Prime Minister's advisor or ministerial interests. And as I said earlier on, I'll repeat the point that I made. We live in a country where you're innocent until proven guilty. This is going to be investigated. As I understand it, there was a discussion with HMRC and he paid what they asked for. He didn't sit and haggle over it or push back on it. He just paid it.
How do we know that?
And I also repeat the point.
No,
I haven't spoken to him. I also repeat the point that Nadeem Zahawi, it would have been his accountants that were doing his tax returns over the last 20 years, not him himself. So if there's an omission, it's probably his accountants that have made it.
I think you're responsible for your own tax returns, though, aren't you?
Ultimately,
and I go back to what HMRC said, their language, it was a careless oversight rather than a deliberate evasion.
Careless can take in a sort of feeling of negligence. That's their term. Careless is the term that they use. But as you say, over £5 million, people might just find that difficult to believe, accountants or not. Let's just go back to my colleague Nick Eardley. Nick, have you heard from the lobby, the briefing that's given to political journalists in Westminster?
Yes, it's just over. It's where we get to ask Number 10 some more detailed questions. And my colleague who's there is saying that Number 10 is saying the Prime Minister didn't know about that penalty that Nadeem Zahawi got in his tax bill until this weekend. You might remember that when we were on the programme on Wednesday, just after Prime Minister's questions, there were some eyebrows raised when Rishi Sunak said that all of the questions asked of Nadeem Zahawi had been answered in full. Those eyebrows were raised because we'd asked questions that we hadn't got answers to. Well, we've just been told by the PM's official spokesman that he didn't know about this until the weekend, the penalty until the weekend when it emerged in reports. So we didn't have a full picture at Prime Minister's questions last week.
Right. I mean, no doubt there'll be endless questions about whether Rishi Sunak still has confidence in his party chairman, Nadeem Zahawi. I don't know whether there was a question or an answer at lobby, Nick.
Yeah, there was. He retains the confidence of Rishi Sunak, which I think means he still has the confidence of the Prime Minister. But I suppose it's now for whatever the independent advisor comes out with.
All right, let's talk about the other issue that is controversial for the government, and that is involving the BBC chairman, Richard Sharp, and a sort of a meeting that he helped set up for Boris Johnson with a distant relative to give him some sort of loan guarantee when he was Prime Minister. But it was shortly before Richard Sharp was appointed, it's a political appointment, to be BBC chairman. What's the latest?
Well, look, I mean, the latest on that is that Rishi Sunak's government is basically saying it wasn't us, that when this all happened, it was under Boris Johnson. They think that the rules were followed properly, that Mr Sharp got the job because he was the best person for the job. And Richard Sharp has emailed BBC staff this morning setting out his version of events, which is basically that, yes, he suggested this potential link to the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, but then flagged up that he was applying for the BBC chairman job and was told, yes, you can't have any more involvement in the process or talk to Boris Johnson about this. But the opposition parties are still knocking on the door with this one, saying there needs to be a full investigation into how it happened, how exactly Boris Johnson went about that process. The BBC has launched its own investigation into whether there was a conflict of interest in Mr Sharp applying for the job and also being involved in linking up Mr Johnson with his billionaire cousin. That one, I think, still has a way to play as well.
All right, Nick Eardley, thank you. Do you support the idea of an investigation, Gareth, into this?
I'll be quite honest, I didn't know I was going to be asked about this until just before I came on, so I don't know enough about it. So my understanding of this is that Mr Sharp referred Boris Johnson to, I think, his own relative, a very distant relative, who might be able to act as a guarantor for a loan, and that he had no further involvement in it.
That's certainly what he says, yes.
Well, indeed, and there's no reason to disbelieve him at this stage.
No. So do you think an investigation is needed or not?
Well, I don't know. I mean, we'll find out what the BBC discover when they look into it. I don't know where we are in terms of any potential investigation in Parliament, but I'm sure that will shed more light on the matter.
I mean, there is an issue, as Rosa said, Albie, with the mantra from Rishi Sunak about integrity, professionalism and accountability. Do you think this yet puts more pressure on Rishi Sunak? To some extent, these are issues that predate him in Boris Johnson's time. But all the same, he's the Prime Minister now.
I mean, there's no doubt about it. The stories that we're talking about today will not be the stories that Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, wants us to be focusing on, or maybe, indeed, that the public want us to be focusing on. I sort of get the sense that maybe some of these stories are a bit exciting to us in the Westminster bubble, but actually perhaps viewers at home and people in the public will want us to be focusing on the cost of living crisis.
That's just shabby.
The NHS crisis.
Shabby, shabby, shabby.
Well, I mean, is it shabby? I mean,
Yeah,
just a point.
because in the end, all of these things end up being excuses for bad behaviour. Whether it's, whether or not you wear a seatbelt, whether it's...
well, let's just show that, because you got very exercised about that in The Guardian. Rishi Sunak fined for not wearing seatbelt during Lancashire visit. This was last week. He was filmed in the back of the car. He was filming himself, I think, without a seatbelt. But actually, interestingly, Dominic Lawson has written in the Daily Mail... Well, I don't know if he doesn't like you, but he certainly doesn't in this column. The Prime Minister has far more integrity than his seatbelt critic, Cardinal of Kent, Chris Bryant. Are you in danger of being a bit too pious over these things by trying to lump them together?
Well, no, I think I'm chair of the Committee on Standards. I think it's important that we have standards in public life. I don't ever claim to be a pure, perfect, wonderful person, as you perfectly well know. And I've said that many, many times in Parliament.
Right.
But I just want to make it clear that when you have a government which repeatedly excused Partygate, and you end up with a Prime Minister, two Prime Ministers now, not quite in a row, because we had another one in the middle, who being fined by the police for different things. When you have the Deputy Prime Minister being investigated by the ethics for bullying on, I think, 4 different counts. When you have... I think Nadine Zahawi has also been accused of not telling the full truth about the Greensill inquiry.
Because Dominic Lawson is saying that you are being far too pious, that there isn't a moral equivalence between not wearing a seatbelt. It is his claim, as some of the other things.
I haven't ever said that.
But Gareth, you wanted to...
I'm assuming then that Chris will be calling for Keir Starmer to be given a fixed penalty notice, because we saw over the weekend pictures of him sitting in the back of taxis giving interviews without wearing a seatbelt.
I think in 1996.
After the seatbelt law was passed. So, these things can go round and round and round, and we can blow as much smoke as we like to try to create the impression of impropriety. I think toning it down, this is a Westminster bubble thing. I really do think we should tone this down.
Is it a Westminster bubble thing, or is it more, it has credibility far beyond Westminster?
Personally, I think that the people who make the laws shouldn't break the laws. And I think that probably the average Joe in the street broadly agrees with that. I mean, I wear my seatbelt. It's not that hard. I pay my taxes. This is what we expect of citizens. And therefore, to the power of 10, we expect that of our politicians.
All right, let's talk about ultra...
By the way, you say that you're in favour of ministers publishing things at the same time. Why did you vote against that in the House of Commons only a few weeks ago, then?
Look, I mean, the statement...
Because the whip's told you.
Well, hang on, let him answer.
The statement you just made about the minister's things not being published or up till May was something I was unaware of at this point. And I happen to agree with Chris.
Should you have been aware of it?
Well, I think that ministers' declarations should be in line with members of Parliament. I think that's a reasonable point. I think they should be in terms of when they are published.
We literally had a vote on it in Parliament, and you voted the other way.
All right, we're going to move on because I want to talk about the ultra-low emission zone. Let's have a look at this headline in the Evening Standard. London suburbs in revolt over Sadiq Khan's ULEZ is the acronym for it, expansion. This is about London Mayor Sadiq Khan announcing the expansion of the zone to all London boroughs from the 29th of August. It will mean more heavily polluting vehicles that don't meet minimum emission standards will have to pay a £12.50 daily fee. In 2020, you will remember the tragic story, 9-year-old Ella Adukisa Deborah, who died following an asthma attack, and she became the first person in the UK to have air pollution listed as a cause of death. She lived near the South Circular Road in Lewisham, South East London, and died in 2013. We're joined by her mother, Rosamond Adukisi Deborah, and she's been campaigning ever since, and probably before, on air pollution levels. Rosamond, can you tell us what happened to Ella?
Yes, absolutely, Joe. Ella, who was not born with asthma, I always have to stress this so it's very clear. She suddenly got asthma, I think 3 months before her 7th birthday. And to show you the extent of her asthma, she is on record as having one of the worst cases of asthma ever in the UK. And that's how severe it was. Initially, it was so bad, she was having fits. and we thought it was epilepsy. We were thinking all sorts of things, but unfortunately, it was the PM 2.5 that, you know, the tiny particles that had got in her bloodstream. And at the first inquest, we were a bit puzzled why the pathologist then said Ella looked as if she had been smoking. And I do recall looking at her consultant, looking a bit puzzled that, sorry, we didn't realise this. And through investigations, I took samples from her body when she passed away. And Sir Stephen Holgate went back to look at it, and PM 2.5 was littered all over her body. So it was always there to start off with.
Yes.
But at the first inquest, obviously, that's not what we were looking for. And the coroner concluded that if it wasn't for the illegal levels of air pollution, not only would she not have got asthma, but she wouldn't have died on that fatal night. And tomorrow, she would have been 19. So this has been 10 years now.
Yeah, no, it's hard to believe so much time has elapsed. You've been campaigning for the Clean Air Bill, or Ella's Law. What would that actually mean?
It will actually mean, and I hope the MPs on there will support it because we're struggling. What it means is clean air will actually be a human right. And it means any decision the government makes through a development, maybe to build a school near a main road, they will have to look at the air pollution. We've also considered indoor air, and I have to stress, indoor air wasn't a reason why Ella passed away, but we have looked at indoor air, things like mold.
Yes.
And it's quite tragic that we didn't know what was to come with Howard's death. So Ella's Law does feature indoor air as well as outdoor air. And it's something that needs to be implemented, because as we look at the National Health Service right now, a lot of illnesses, diseases, cancers, autoimmune diseases, and everything really has been linked to air pollution.
Well, as you say, certainly linked or shortening people's lives. Certainly there is evidence of that. You're supporting the expansion of the ultra-low emission zone in London, presumably because you believe it will improve air quality.
I am supporting it, and I need to be very clear about this. So at Ella's inquest, it was the Borough of Lewisham, they were one of the parties, the government, and we know what the coroner said about the government. Unless they clean up the air, children will continue to die, and children have. The number of children dying from asthma hasn't changed. But one of the reasons why I am supporting it, if you remove the politics out of it, all the experts who took part in the inquest, they all made recommendations to the coroner. And the one thing they all agreed on was that the ultra-low emission zone must be expanded. And when you look at the data now, in the areas where the ultra-low emission zone isn't there, the premature deaths are higher. So places like Bromley, Croydon has...
Well, you're mentioning Bromley, which, of course, Orpington is in Bromley, in your constituency, rather, is in the borough of Bromley. You're not in favour of the expansion of the zone. Listening to Rosamond there, are you not convinced it is a must?
No. Now, some of the things that Rosamond said there, I would agree with. So where we cite schools, I think, is an extremely important point. But the ultra-low emission zone, the Mayor knows this as well, because the Mayor's own study showed that expanding the ultra-low emission zone to Outer London would have a minor to negligible impact on air quality. This isn't about air quality, it's about raising money. And Rosamond mentioned Bromley. This is coming from a report from Imperial College, I believe, the methodology of which has been severely criticised because it aggregates out death and it doesn't factor in age of people who are dying. Bromley has a very elderly population, many of whom are in care homes, and these people are included as being said that they are dying prematurely because of air quality. Actually, Bromley has amongst the best air quality in the country, and certainly amongst the best in London. So I'm not in favour.
Well, Rosamond's shaking her head. Let me get a response from you, Rosamond, and then I'll get the others in.
Absolutely not. It's a shame there's not a respiratory consultant on this call right now. The number of children dying from asthma since my daughter died, that has not changed. When we look at countries like Sweden, Finland, they have 0 deaths from asthma. Asthma has increased, and the only time children didn't die from asthma in this country is between 23rd of March 2020 and the 4th of July.
All right, well,
and what was going on then?
Right.
Lockdown was going on during then.
Indy, let me get Gareth to respond.
Yes, the irony is that during lockdown, the only way that people could get around, or the best way people could get around, was driving their cars. Look, in outer London, air pollution is not the thing. So since Rosamund tragically died, that was, I think you said 10 years ago.
Rosamund Ella is her daughter.
Ella, I beg your pardon. I meant no offence there.
Yeah.
But since she tragically died, of course, the ultra-low emission zone, which was conceived when Boris Johnson was the Mayor of London, was introduced in central London, and nobody disputes that that is a good idea. And then it was expanded to the North and South Circular, which would, of course, take in Lewisham. And again, nobody's opposing that. It's expanding it out to the Greater London boundary. That's where the problem lies.
All right.
Because air quality is not poor there, and you don't need to be doing it. And the Mayor knows this because his own report tells him so. Just
to show you this a map here of clean air zones, not just in London. They have been introduced, as you can see here, in other cities across the UK. And there are future plans, as we'll see in this map, of other zones being put in place in Aberdeen, Dundee, Edinburgh, etc. Do you support the expansion of the zone, or is it about money?
40,000 people die of poor air quality in the country every year, and we should be doing something about it. It's crazy that it's taken us such a long time to
Well, when you say they die, it's not put on their death certificates in the way it was with Ella. It is about shortening. Well, I mean, it is an important distinction because in the case of Ella, it was actually, she was the first person to have that on her death certificate.
Because the particular, yes, the particular
others could have their lives shortened, but
indeed,
they weren't killed by it.
OK, I was going to make that point myself, but so methodologies vary between different respiratory experts, but the truth of the matter is that most of them agree with a figure of 40,000 people every year dying in the UK with this as a contributory factor. And that if we were to tackle the problems that you have, in particular along some motorways and some road areas, there are different means of doing that. So in my local authority area, for instance, on the A470, you can only drive at 50 miles an hour instead of 70 on the dual carriageway. All of these things help. I think it's a terrible shame that Outer London wants everybody else to have to clean up their air, but doesn't want Outer London to do so. I think it's disgraceful attitude that's been. Well, actually, Outer London has the worst improving air of anywhere.
But it already has very good air
in the southeast, and you have 204 people, according to the methodology that you've just laid out,
deeply flawed methodology.
Well.
That's not actual people. That's an aggregate that's drawn without any kind of weighting at all in terms of age or in terms of preconditions or any of those things. Which
I understand
really
that point. I just think you're fighting against common sense. Frankly, we all know that we've got.
Why didn't you come to Orpington and talk to my constituents about common sense?
You come and talk.
You would have a really good conversation on the doorstep if you try to advance that argument.
I'm not sure that this kind of just pointing, wagging fingers is going to do any good for anybody. I think there is a common sense argument, which is that we need cars that are cleaner.
Right.
We need to, apart from anything else, I'd like us to get to a net zero carbon situation, and we need to take every single, do everything we possibly can to get to that.
But there is an important row about whether or not it will actually improve air quality and whether or not this is going to restrict people who need their cars, their vehicles, to get around outer and inner London.
Look, I think everyone wants cleaner air. I don't think that is something which we are debating. It is the measures that we put in place to get that cleaner air. And I don't like this idea that we're going to put restrictions on how people live their lives so we can get cleaner air. I'd much prefer that we provided the infrastructure so people can use electric cars, so people can use public transport in a way that means people can continue to live their lives freely, but the air gets cleaner rather than just saying, well, we're going to charge you to drive around London when you're a small business owner, perhaps a builder, that has to rely on their car in order to get their livelihood.
Isn't the polluter pays a pretty good principle?
Well, I think it depends which polluter it is, but my point is,
why does it depend which polluter it is?
Because ultimately, you know, if you are a young person who can cycle into work, then there's no problem. But if you are someone that relies on a heavy goods vehicle, for example, and there's literally no other way that you can do your trade without it, then I feel that seems a bit not very equitable.
There are a series of exemptions under the scheme, and people can have a grace period up until 2027. I think the Mayor of London has done a pretty good job at trying to make a scheme that will work.
Rosa?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, my heart goes out to Rosamund. I live near Lewisham. My kids are similar age, and I can't imagine what you've been going through these last 10 years. I sort of agree with everyone. It's one of the many reasons I'm glad I'm not a politician, which is that we need to clean up our air. We can't have our kids breathing this stuff. But I do worry about people who, that's people you're talking about, and also, you know, we're in a cost of living crisis when people have got old bangers that they can't really afford to replace. And I do worry about the impact on them. And I wonder if we could have some more schemes, perhaps through the Mayor of London, perhaps through central government, where there's incentives for people to go green. And we definitely need to improve our green technology. I mean, we've been hearing about how hard it is for electric car users to charge their cars. And this technology is just not advancing at the pace that we need it to.
And Rosamond, listening to the discussion and the fact that it would be a cost, obviously a daily cost on people with those heavy polluting vehicles in a cost of living crisis, do you think more needs to be done before it is introduced by the Mayor, the sorts of things that Rosa was saying to make the climate greener?
I think we need to be clear that 85% of cars currently are compliant, and that's going to go up to 91% by August. So we're talking about 10% of cars who actually need support on this. And I was one of those nagging the Mayor to increase bus services, especially out of London. And the government also need to invest in public transport. So we all realise that, you know, the cost of living crisis. But let's be really, really honest. People who are really, really poor, they are the ones who rely on buses on the main roads, who are breathing in this filthy air. They will never be able to afford an electric vehicle ever. So I think when people say poor, I think we just need to be really careful. But 85% of cars are currently compliant.
All right, Gareth, and then...
So just on that point, I mean, I'm inclined to agree with that. But the Mayor of London, Transport for London, produced a report in 2019 that showed that in outer London, households with an income of only £10,000 normally needed to use a car to get around. And that goes up to 72% when you get to £20,000. So we're not talking about rich people here. We are talking about people that cannot afford to simply replace their car, who are going to either get hit with a £4,500 bill per year, or they're not going to be able to get around.
Finally.
That's exactly the point that I was going to make. If we look at some of these other places, you know, I think I saw Bradford on there, I think I saw Oxford, the public transport provision is very poor and people rely on their cars in order to get around.
All right, that's all we have time for, but thank you very much to you, Rosamond, for joining us today. And we'll talk to you again, no doubt, if that bill goes through. Let me just show you this headline. It's actually from a week ago, last week. Daily Mirror, out of touch Tory MP says nurses using food banks should budget better. It was a comment made by the former Levelling Up Secretary and Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Simon Clarke, as nurses walked out in a dispute over pay and conditions. He was asked about that comment in the newspaper on BBC Politics North yesterday. Let's have a listen.
If you are earning the average nurse's wage, which is £35,000 a year, according not to me but to the Royal College of Nursing, if you are earning that salary, then I do not believe that is a salary at which routinely you should need to use a food bank. And I think that is an important thing to say. Obviously, the median salary in this country is about £28,000.
What did you make of his comments, Rosa?
To quote, yes, Minister, very brave, very brave remarks. I don't think they're going to go down very well with...
Although he doubled down.
He doubled down,
yeah.
I think it's the kind of thing, you know, you can say what you want and you can do the maths and you can sort of work it all out. I think it's just a bad look at a time when nurses are on strike and we're all worried about the cost of living to be telling them how they should be managing their budgets. I think it looks patronising, and I actually think that quite a lot of Conservative MPs would take a different approach and wouldn't use that form of words.
Gareth, would you?
Well, no, I personally wouldn't have done because of the... I completely agree about the emotion around the argument about nurses at the moment. Also, it's far too generalised in terms of a comment because there's lots of nuance here. If you're on £35,000 a year and you have a number of children and you're the major breadwinner, or you're in a joint income household, one of you dies or loses their job, then of course your circumstances are very, very different. So on a case-by-case basis, I think it's very difficult to get into this debate speaking in generalised terms. So personally, no, I wouldn't have used that description. But there is a case to be made, and I've spent time talking to my local food bank and I've been to see them. They work very much in conjunction with the Citizens Advice Bureau, and very often people that are coming to the food bank are there because they don't know what benefits they might be entitled to, and sometimes it is a question about how they're managing their personal finances, and CAB can help with that. And I think that's probably the point that Simon was trying to make there. But of course, it's been swept up in a lot of media noise and it's distracted from the real issue. Well,
I mean, he's very clear in what he says. I mean, is he right, Simon Clarke, that if you are earning £35,000, you shouldn't need to routinely use food banks?
But I thought the word routinely was doing an awful lot of work in that sentence, and the word if at the beginning as well. Nurses start on 27,000.
Absolutely, yeah.
Look, what is shocking is that anybody needs to go to a food bank. We are one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And particularly shocking that people who are in work, and this is what I've seen in my local food bank over the last few years. It used to be a particular category of person who'd fallen on hard times, having a difficult, might have a crisis in their life because of a divorce, a broken relationship, or being evicted from their house. Now, it is much more commonly somebody who is in work, has a family, has kids, and they are really, really struggling. And of course, the fact that energy bills have doubled is part of the problem. But in particular, I find it really depressing when it is the people that we clapped during the pandemic, and we suddenly discovered that all these people on lower incomes were actually key workers in the, people who drive buses and people who keep supermarkets going and all the rest of it. It is really depressing that those people are, whether it's routinely or even occasionally, having to go to a food bank. We shouldn't be a country where you have to put out the begging bowl when you work for your living.
Albie?
Look, I don't think it's appropriate for people to be judging and dictating other people who use food banks, especially people who are unlikely to have ever or will ever use food banks in their entire life and who are very well paid. So I actually found that comment from Simon, and actually a lot of other people have been making similar comments, quite difficult.
Lee Anderson.
Be that as it may, sure, definitely people can help ease the cost of living crisis by better personal budgeting, perhaps trading down in supermarkets. There is a role for better personal finance, but it's how you phrase those comments, and I think the phraseology of that was tough.
But you just ended up doing exactly what you said people shouldn't do, trading down in supermarkets. Do you think poorer people haven't actually thought about trying to get the cheapest available brand in the supermarket? We had this from another minister last year. It's been a series of Tory MPs who go on television and lecture people about how to manage their personal finances.
I wasn't lecturing anyone, Chris. I was just making...
people
That's
should
not
trade down in
I didn't say
the
they
supermarket.
should. I said they could. It's a different word. I'm not lecturing anyone. I'm just saying there is a role for personal budgeting and personal finance to ease the cost of living crisis. Do you disagree with that?
You've just done it again.
But do you disagree with that? Is there a role or not?
No, it's the patronising
But it's not. I said there could be.
patronising assumption behind it, which basically says these poor people haven't even thought about doing better budgeting. Honestly, it really angers me.
Well, that is an assumption of motivation, obviously, behind the comment. Is that what you meant?
No, that's not what I meant. I was just simply making the point that there is a role for personal finance when it comes to easing the cost of living crisis. I've done it personally. Maybe everyone else around the table has done it personally. It's not me passing a judgment on someone else or being condescending towards other people.
What does that mean?
And how they manage the cost of living crisis.
I mean, in terms of food banks themselves, poverty existed before food banks actually came into fruition here. I mean, isn't that the case too, that it's not that poverty has just started with the emergence of food banks?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that, as Chris said, we would like to think that there is a world, that there is a country where the people who we rely on to care for us in our hospitals feel comfortable in their salary. Retention is a huge problem at the moment. I mean, I think that's one of the key demands of the strikers, not so much their pay, but actually their working conditions, because they're so chronically understaffed. And you cannot get people to work. The nurses' bursaries were removed, and that's been a big problem again for retention and for pay. So part of the reason perhaps that they're struggling to make ends meet is because they're repaying student loans as well.
Right,
so,
and it does come back to the issue of pay, which is the main driver of the dispute, the ongoing dispute, isn't it, Gareth?
Well, that's certainly why they've gone on strike, is over pay and conditions, I understand.
Right. I mean, in terms of trying to retain nurses, though, and other medical staff in the future, the issue of pay is important. I mean, Chris is right that a lot of people going to food banks are in work. I mean, how do you explain that?
Well, I mean, I've never had to use a food bank, fortunately. So people will say they haven't got enough money, but I come back to the point earlier on that sometimes people will have to look at how they manage their personal finances, and there's nothing wrong in that. That's not in any way a criticism of anybody, and it's not patronising to say so.
It is.
Lee Anderson, hang on, Chris, if I may finish, if I may finish my point.
Yep.
Lee Anderson's comments are based on his time working for Citizens Advice Bureau. He used to sit there with people and go through their finances and advise them about how they can.
But he was accused of being tin-eared, wasn't he, at the time?
Was he at the time?
Yes, there were a lot of people that said it was tin-eared. What do you?
They're saying it now. Look, I mean, people need to look after their personal finances. That's perfectly true. You have to.
We've had ministers saying, just go out and get that better paid job, just go and work more hours. It just is not as simple as that. We've had energy prices doubling in a year.
We're at the end of the
wages
programme, I'm afraid.
suppressed
Chris can
and
carry
no
on, but that's
growth
all we have time for
in
today. And
Tory
Alex
Britain.
Forsyth will be here tomorrow with more Politics Live. From all of us here, bye-bye.
Oh, it's on pause for now. I have to restart the stream, play yesterday's, and then get ready for PMQs, which is today. 4 hours. Oh shit.
Today, the Tory party chairman on the